Our scripture has been read in our hearing, that 137th Psalm. If I were to put a tag on the text this morning, it would be a song to sing in sorrow. A song to sing in sorrow. The time which this psalm is written is around 587 BC. The nation of Israel has been overthrown. The city of Jerusalem lays in ruins. The elite of Judah have been taken into bondage in Babylon, while a remnant of sufferers who have survived the onslaught are left behind in ruins. The elite exiled survivors find themselves brutally carried away into captivity in a strange land to them, cut off from their homeland, their city, their heritage. They find themselves in a place of hopelessness. They find themselves cut off even from their faith as they understood it, because the temple had been destroyed. No longer were they able to worship God in the temple that housed the Ark of the Covenant. They were unable to offer sacrifices to God on the altar as they had always done. They found themselves now estranged in a strange land. I don't know about you, but often, sometimes, even in this country, I find myself in a strange land. A strange land founded by immigrants whose very symbol of liberty proclaims, "Give me your tired, your poor, your huddled masses yearning to breathe free." But now immigrants are treated harshly at the borders of our country. A strange land where we talk about a perfect union that seems so imperfect with the deeply divided partisan politics we now face. A strange land where justice is denied to some while the powerful and privileged seem to skirt the law. A strange land where domestic tranquility has been disturbed by vicious violence and victimization. A strange land where the common defense is not so common for all, but exercised only for some. A strange land where the promotion of the general welfare is really a farce for many who can't get their basic rights, welfare, or seemingly have well-being. A strange land where we don't find these truths to be self-evident, that all are created equal, because when we look around, we see so many who are disenfranchised. A place where indeed our Creator has given us inalienable rights, but yet these rights, like voting rights, are being denied and taken back. Segments of our society have to fight for health care and affordable housing. Liberty is denied to some in our culture and context. We find ourselves in a strange land, I tell you. A strange land exposed to what we said was a democracy that seems to be diminishing by the day. A strange land with disturbingly dysfunctional political system that continues to promote policies that maintain the status quo of elitism, that disregards the marginalized in our land. A strange land, I tell you, where things that we talk about, equality and equity, are misplaced. As we find racism, sexism, classism, and a whole lot of isms I don't even have time to list. We too are living in a strange land, just as these Judeans found themselves in a strange land. Our strange land, we find that the country's governing documents don't match the lived reality that some people live each and every day. Our nations, our systems are broken in so many places, whether we're talking the public sector, the private, or even the political sector. We find ourselves too lamenting so much of what we see going on. The Hebrews found themselves lamenting the terrible injustice of being found taken from their homeland destroyed, and being carried away in bondage. They felt God had abandoned them, and they felt that was an injustice. They felt that they had no future hope in the present state that they were living. They felt like they were once a great nation, but never to be again. They lamented it all because so much had befallen them. They found themselves having to face, looking in the mirror, that some of why they ended up where they were had to do with how they had acted before God. They found themselves disobedient to God, and God allowed, if you will, this Babylonian captivity so that the people of God would begin to act again like the people of God and pray and commit themselves to God. Yes, you know how it goes. We don't miss our water until our wells run dry. They attended the temple when it was convenient, but then when they couldn't go at all, they were disheartened. They loved home and all that home offered, but when home was destroyed, they had a longing and an aching in their hearts. You see, sometimes we don't miss things until they're gone, but people of God, we must stand up for what we believe in, what we stand for, and what God has given to us. You see, they were living in a strange land because of their sin before God. They didn't appreciate what they had before being carried away. And people of God, I want to suggest to us, if we're not careful, we too may be carried away. No, not into bondage like this. But if we're not good citizens and do our part and what God has called us to do, to participate in the world in which we live in, to do good and to do no harm, and to participate in the affairs of this land, to make sure that people do right, then we too might find ourselves in trouble as well, lamenting like this song. We'll find ourselves in grief and anger altogether. That's really what was on their hearts. They were grieving what they lost, but they were angry at where they were. They were remembering the past glory days in their homeland and lamenting for a return to the previous good fortune they once had. They were homesick, pining for a return to home. They were exiled and lamenting. Their cries were cries of despair because they felt that God had been heavy-handed with them and harsh to them, and they were estranged from their God. I want to tell you, it's bad enough to be displaced, but to then find yourself estranged from God puts you in a vulnerable spiritual position, one that you ought not find yourself in if you continue to stay in contact with God. Even when you're lamenting, when you are angry, that's the right time to talk to God. But I hear you. I know that some of you are afraid to really talk to God like you really want to talk to God. But you see, this text raises for me, how honest are we with ourselves before God? Do we really allow ourselves to be real and raw with our emotions before God? Do we bring our sadness and sorrow to God? Do we bring our heated anger looking for honest answers from God? Do we allow our deepest, darkest thoughts and feelings to be uttered before God, even though God already knows? I ask this because I think many of us don't. Just last week, I must tell you, a confession is good for the soul, always bad for the reputation, but I had to have a heart-to-heart talk with God. I was sad and sorrowful. I was angry and agitated because I was upset that God had taken one promising ministerial student from our view. I know she rests in the hands of God, but sometimes we just don't understand why it is God does what God does, how God does it, and why God does it. And sometimes God won't even answer our prayers. But the truth of the matter is God will calm our hearts and our spirits and ultimately show us it's in God's will and way. How brutally honest have you been with God lately? The truth is that many of us, if you will, edit our prayers. We won't tell God really all about it because we're afraid that God can't handle it or won't hear it. But I want to suggest to us, really, many of us don't do it because we come from church cultures where we were taught not to question God. We were taught in our churches that we needed to hide our real emotional selves when we were angry with God. And some of us grew up expecting that everything ought to be all right. We ought to keep a smile on our faces no matter what's going on around us. We were taught that even if things weren't all right, that we had to fake it until we could make it. But the reality is, I want you to know that God can handle it. If you ever take a time to go through the lament Psalms, you'll find out that folks said all kinds of things to God and weren't afraid to say it, because where else to take your problems but to the Lord in prayer? And so here they are, finding themselves emotional, lamenting, crying, upset and angry because they were living in a situation that was not of their own making. They felt they were living in a broken world. Yes, they were in the land of Babylonian and given some freedoms, but they were truly not free to go as they pleased. They did have some freedoms and they did have some rights, but the reality was they were still not fully free. And I want you to know that if you are in that kind of condition, you're still not free. And so the psalmist begins expressing the psalmist and Judah's strong feelings of sorrow for their situation and circumstance. Judah had not forgotten all that had happened in the hostile takeover, where friends and family were killed as they were carried off away, and those who were left in ruins with nothing. And though they were now sitting in Babylon with some rights, they still were not fully free. And so as we turn to our text, the context of our text is important. And I want to just take a walk through it real quickly. The fact was they were in sorrow and anger, and they were by the rivers in Babylon, and they decided to hang their harps upon the willows. The rivers are significant in this text because rivers were partly how the Babylonians became prosperous as a nation. Rivers were important to watering the fertile ground, fishing for food, and as a means of transporting products. Babylon was located in a river valley, and Babylonians were expert at building canals and irrigation systems, which would enable them to not have to deal with the drought that was so often surrounding them. They had it going on. Land was fertile. Things were happening. They were able to produce, and the means of producing was producing those who were living prosperous lives. But the reality is that even if you are seemingly prospering on the one hand, but not free on the other hand, in other ways, you're still not fully free. They were there by the rivers of Babylon. And I think in that positioning of themselves there, they were also experiencing, if you will, a remembrance from the past as they sat by the waters that were there, symbolizing prosperity and all that was going well. But then they were remembering too, some centuries ago, that they too had their family and loved ones by the water, and they were delivered through the water. And they remembered that the waters were significant to them because it was their deliverance through the waters. And so what they decided to do, the psalmist says, was to hang their harps on the willows. They refused, in other words, to listen up to what was being asked of them. They had been asked to sing one of the Lord's songs. Well, how do you sing when you're really feeling down? How do you sing when you're really sulking with your life situation and circumstance? How do you sing to your oppressors who are simply mocking you and making fun of you because you don't really have any power, and the songs that you sing don't seem to have any power? The Babylonians were there. Can you imagine them saying to them in some ways, why is it that you don't sing one of your catchy church songs? Why don't you just sing and get out of your moping? Why don't you sing? And that was like adding salt to an open wound. It was adding insult to injury to these who were captive, finding themselves mocked and maligned for their faith, for their sacred songs were being mocked, and religious rituals were being made fun of. They were being taunted, required to sing one of the songs of Zion. It was saying, sing one of those happy songs, but you can't sing happy songs when you're sad. But sometimes you ought to sing sad songs when you're sad until you can find a grace note that'll turn the sadness into joy and celebration. You see, I've learned a long time that our people of old knew how to sing sad songs. They sang the blues and other things, but they did not sing it without hope. They sang it to express their situation and circumstance, but always with a grace note, looking for the hope that was to come. Yes, life had brought these folks to their knees, estranged from their homeland, a familiar space, estranged from their church, their sacred space, estranged from their God, the place of safety and grace and salvation. But yet, they had a song that they refused to sing to their captors, but a song on their hearts reminding them by the rivers of Babylon that they had once sang, their people sang as they came through the waters, I will sing to the Lord, for he has triumphed graciously and gloriously. The horse and his rider was thrown into the sea. The Lord is my strength and my song, and he has become my salvation. This is my God. I will praise him. My father's God, I will exalt him. You see, they had a song on their hearts. And what I'm trying to suggest to us, people of God, sometimes when your tempters are calling you to sing, you don't sing to them. You sing to your God. You sing of who your God is and who your God is to you, and how you know that God is the way, the truth, and the life, and your deliverance through whatever situation you find yourselves in. They said to these folks, how can we sing the Lord's song in the midst of our devastating losses and overwhelming tragedies? Judah wondered how they could sing, though they had a song in their heart. They worried about how they would ever get back home and how things would ever be the same. But don't miss the fact that they were by the waters, one, seeing the prosperity in Babylon, and yet also remembering their deliverance from Egypt, their ancestors' deliverance from Egypt. But don't miss the fact that this act of hanging their harps on the willow and refusing to sing and play music was a sign of protest. It was a sign of protest, saying that I'm not going to do what you tell me to do. I'm not going to go step and fetch it. I'm not going to go to your whims. I'm going to stand up and protest without seemingly protesting, because I'm making a stand. I'm not going to do what you say do. I'm going to do what God is telling me to do. I'm going to keep my song in my heart and continue to move on until God brings deliverance from my situation. You see, people of God, what I'm trying to say to us is that I know somebody else is sorrowful and is already angry at some things about how things are happening around us. But what I want to say is keep your song in your heart and sing it unto God. Keep a melody in your heart to lift up to God, knowing that even in your present situation, God knows where you are, God knows what you're going through, and God has a way through for you. Hebrews, we're being challenged to forget the past and come on, live as good a life as you can right here where you are. Can't you hear them marking them? We ain't been bad to you. We haven't taken full advantage of you. You can make a good life for you in this fertile sense right here where you are. You see, oppressors always do that. They try to make us assimilate and to then give up on the hope that God has for us. They try to get us to accept second best than the best God has for us. And when I look around this country and look at all that's happening around us, there's a whole lot that we ought to stand up and hang our harps on the willows and refuse to sing the song of this land and sing a new song unto God in our hearts. Because day by day, I don't know about you, but I look as the power structure is taking away voting rights, women's rights to choose, marital rights are soon on the horizon, LGBTQIA rights are on the chopping block. The constitutional rights are being substituted for individual states' rights. I'm telling you, we're living in a strange land. And as we are sitting here today, people are plotting and planning to take away some of the things that have been hard fought to win. And they just want us to take it, to assimilate, to forget about full freedom, and accept the bondage that you find yourselves in, and the oppression that they will push that looks good on the surface, but we know under the surface is bad. The psalmist is saying the exiles have determined to protest, to hang their harps on the willows, to be counted that they will not just simply do what they're asked to do. They're going to fight it in the ways that they can without destroying the rest of themselves. You see, the psalmist, on behalf of the people, shifts from the collective cry of the people and lifts up his own cry to God, moves from the communal to the personal, and says, not only did they refuse to sing and play, but I personally, if I forget you, O Jerusalem, and let my right hand wither, let my tongue cleave to the roof of my mouth, if I don't remember you, if I don't set Jerusalem above my highest joy. What is the psalmist getting at? He said, I'd rather that my tongue and my hand be paralyzed and to forget who I am and whose I am. The psalmist is saying that he desires to go back home and to go back to the place where he found home, and not only home, he found a home in God. I want to go back to the place, to the touchstone, those symbolic places where I can be back in relationship with God and back in relationship with the people of God that I have grown up with. I want to go back because this is not my home. You see, sometimes the pressures to assimilate and just simply take injustice will make us take to saying some strong things. But we got to be strong in our resolve to stand up for right and righteousness, because there ought to be a hankering in all of our hearts, longing for God and for justice. There ought to be a hankering in our hearts where we're asking God to restore this broken world we're living in. There ought to be a longing in our hearts to build beloved community all around us. You see, we've got to build a community where all can be free. The psalmist is protesting and yet crying out to God at the same time. I like that sometimes you got to protest in front of your oppressors, but then talk to God about how you really feel. And they began to tell God, and this psalmist himself on his behalf, how he really laments and expresses his longing to God right then in some harsh words that many of us would not dare to use. He says, as he prays this prayer song, remember, O Lord, against the Edomites, the day of Jerusalem's fall, how they said, tear it down to its foundation. O daughter Babylon, you devastator, happy shall be those who pay you back what you have done to us. Happy shall they be who take your little ones and dash them against the stones. These are harsh and hard words, I tell you. And the last verse almost makes all of us shudder of what he's saying, but let's clearly understand what he is really trying to communicate. If you really understand this, what he is really demonstrating here is his cry to God of the injustice, and in the world in which he lived in, injustice was handled by reciprocity, that what was done by the offender could be done back by the offender. It was the eye for an eye and tooth for a tooth understanding of justice in his day. And that's all he was crying for, what was due in his day. We and the New Testament know that's not what God tells us to do. What we're to do is to pray for our enemy. Because what I've learned is that if you pray for your enemy, it's like heaping coals upon their head. You don't have to do a thing. Watch what God will do through the prayers that you pray for your enemies. But then he also prays this prayer that way and uses the term children or babies in the context of the same way they were known as the children of God. He was not talking about children per se, but the nation of Babylon as the children of Babylon, the people of Babylon. He was not trying to harm babies, but simply trying to say what harm you cause to my kinfolks ought to happen to you as a nation. But here's what I really want you to get, is that the psalmist was raw with his emotions. He was not calling for an enactment of this kind of violence, but rather he had a righteous indignation about all that had happened. And here's what I want to say to us people of God, you just ought to get some righteous indignation. When you see all that's going on around us, don't just criticize, you ought to get mad. Now, not mad just for the sake of madness, because it'll drive you mad. What I'm talking about is an anger that makes you get up and take some action. A righteous indignation that says, I won't stand here and stand for this any longer. I've got to do something. And the first thing you ought to do is what the psalmist did, is tell God all about it and say, God, what do you want me to do about it? Sometimes we fail to do that. We get angry, criticize, and do nothing, but wake up the next day to do the same thing all over again. We've got to give it to God, realizing that reciprocity is not our way, because the Bible is clear that vengeance is the Lord and the Lord will repay the way the Lord will do it. The Lord knows what the Lord is doing. But we've got to sing our song to God and get our marching orders from God. Don't forget that though this is a lament psalm, it's in the hymnal of Israel. It is a song to be sung in their sad times. It is a song of worship. And what I'm saying to us, people of God, you got to learn to sing when you don't want to sing. You got to learn to sing when everything's bad around you. You got to learn to sing when life is so troublesome that you don't see a bright side anywhere, but sing anyhow until the Son of God will shine again on you. You see, it's hard to worship through your pain, your sorrow, and yes, your anger. But the psalmist learned that just if he would have a little talk with God, everything would be all right. He was living in a conflicted culture at the moment, but he realized that if he put it in the hands of God, he knew that God could handle it. God could handle the mocking. God could handle the taunting. God could handle getting them back home out of the strange land. God could handle restoring them from their suffering. God can do it, but we've got to be willing to sing in our sorrow and suffering, sing in our anger and anguish, sing about our circumstance and situation, sing to God for deliverance, and sing to God expecting that God's going to do something. You see, the reality is that some of us sing songs that we don't believe ourselves. But I want to suggest to you, I've learned through hard time and hard knocks that if I sing unto the Lord, somehow or another, my spirit is lifted. And you see, the truth of the matter is we know this too, because when we look back at our ancient forefathers and foreparents, we knew that they knew how to sing in sorrow. They knew how to sing. When I think about the civil rights movement, and though I'm just a child of the movement and the human rights movement, I learned that the ancestors knew how to sing in the face of all of the trouble they were facing. They knew how to sing, oh freedom over me. Before I'll be a slave, I'll be buried in my grave and go home to my Lord and be free. They knew how to sing, I shall overcome. We shall overcome one day. They knew how to sing, trials dark on every hand when we try to do what's right. Though we do the best we can, always we're seldom right, but I'm glad that Jesus just knows. He knows just how much we can bear. But if we keep on singing, we can sing, there's a bright side somewhere. A bright side somewhere. It might be dark and the clouds might be hanging low. The rain may be falling outside, but I want you to know, Paulette, I see that the sun is shining beyond the clouds. I recognize and realize that God is still smiling on us. I realize that as dark as the day, as the devil tries to make it, that God still has light for me and for all of us. If we just hold on and hang in there, you might hang your harps on the willows, but sing to the Lord. Lord, I need you right now. I need you every hour. Sing a song to God until your spirits get lifted and you know that even in the midst of what's going on around you, you're free in your heart. And once you get free in your heart, God will tell you how to get free in your feet and do what you need to do to make it through. You see, I've learned now to sing the Lord's song. And what I love is that sometimes I learned back at Hampton University, the song of our alma mater has a line in there that I love so well. That sometimes I might not sing with my voice, I'm just going to sing with my life. You got to let your life do the singing. So what I'm saying to us this morning at Colesville and all over is that we've got to learn to sing the Lord's song, even in strange lands. Learn to sing it sometimes to your enemies, but sing it to God first and foremost. And then sing it so much so that you take action yourself. Somebody ought to say amen right about here. Sing in your sadness and sorrow. Sing when you're criticizing and complaining. Sing in your anger and agitation. There's a whole lot to be that about in this country. But I've learned you got to stop just singing vocally and start doing something. This season that we're in right now, I'll just put in this commercial and y'all will forgive me for putting it in because it's still good religion. The fact is you got to help get folks registered. You got to help get folks to the polls. You got to get folks out there to be able to know what to vote for. You got to start educating yourself so you can educate some other folk. You got to help hold your candidates accountable and not let them just get away with it all. You got to advocate for the issues. You got to go downtown and testify at the hearings. You got to involve yourself with some action so that freedom will come to your door as well, so that you can say, do not be discouraged. Whatever betides, God will. God will. God will. God will take care of each of us. Amen.